So today I am going to be making Chinese buns from spelt flour. I have seen people use spelt flour before, but they didn't use wholemeal spelt flour. And I've also tried to use wholemeal wheat flour with Chinese buns before, and the results were not that good. So I'll tell you why I'm choosing to use spelt today. So first up, is spelt healthier than wheat? I think from like a health perspective, like when you're looking at, like the proteins and the fats and whatever, spelt is very close to wheat. It is like a cousin of wheat. It also has gluten in it as well. So it's very similar. I think spelt has like a little bit more protein. How it differs is health and food industry like to use like kind of like more, I think like gimmicky terms like ancient grains to sell things like, spelt or amaranth or millet or something like that. In modern day context, what that means is just these are grains that have not been overly produced like wheat, like corn, like something like soybean. When you massively farm crops like that is, well, first the soil gets really screwed up. So you don't have all of the beneficial, whether it be fungus, whether it be beneficial bacteria, and that affects the health of the plant as well. That affects what we eat. The other thing is, because we want to massively farm a particular product, people end up changing its composition. So I've heard today's wheat that we breed it so that there's no husk, but because there's no husk, then we have to put in specific enzymes so that pests won't eat it. The problem with this enzyme is sometimes in our bodies, we are also unable to digest that as well. And even 10 years ago when I was at a talk about gluten, they were saying that, wheat bread today has more of like a gluten content or like a stronger type of gluten content in it because it makes the flour eventually more shelf stable. It makes it last longer. That can also make it more difficult for us humans to digest as well. What I know about spelt flour is that apparently the gluten in spelt flour is more easily digestible. Apparently it is a water-soluble gluten compared to wheat, which is not water-soluble. So when you work wheat gluten, it just gets tougher and tougher and tougher into, this ball. And I think for some people that gets harder and harder to digest. Whereas apparently with spelt gluten, because it is water soluble and it can be dissolved in water, it may not be as tough to digest. And so that's why some people find it easier to digest spelt. Now, if you have a gluten allergy, you have a gluten allergy. So you shouldn't be having spelt in general. But it'll be interesting. This is my first time working with spelt wholemeal. So that means that, the outside bran and everything, that's going to be in here. That's all going to be ground up. And we'll see how it does, because it does have gluten in it, which is great because it might function a little bit more like wheat, but then also have, potentially some of the benefits of being kind of an underprocessed type grain. Half a teaspoon yeast. So what I've done here is 2 cups of wholemeal spelt, and I will put the recipe down below. At first, I added yeast and I added a couple of other ingredients, but the recipe that worked best was adding an extra teaspoon of miso into the water and then dissolving that and then slowly pouring that into the flour and just working it until you get a nice smooth ball of dough. Spelt is just like a different, like there is gluten in it, but it's almost like it's already been cut a little bit. These are water-soluble gluten molecules, so it doesn't it almost feels like you're working with a gluten-free dough. It does not stretch the way that normal wheat dough would. It does not stretch the way that you would expect a dough with gluten to. Relatively a smooth ball of dough. We're going to just let this ferment, let this rise for, an hour and a half. Let's see how it goes. Warm place. So this was about an hour and a half before it kind of doubled in size. The first time I kneaded, it only took about 4 minutes. Like it wasn't like typical gluten dough where it took a really long time to get the dough smooth. So just kind of divide it into however big you want your buns to be. Remember that they're gonna rise, so between 5 to 6 pieces. And when you're forming them, I would say keep it nice and spherical, like give it some height, because I did a couple tests here, but for our second ferment, it only requires about 15 minutes, because if you over ferment it, there's just not enough gluten, there's not enough structure to keep it nice and round, and so sometimes it would flatten when it started cooking. So make these balls kind of nice and circular and spherical, give it height, and then 15 minutes rest before you start steaming it on high heat for about 12 minutes. So I was quite surprised about the texture because it was still fluffy and it wasn't mealy. Like wholemeal wheat flour tasted mealy, but these were actually pretty good. Yes, a bit drier and maybe is expected, but it also didn't require any additional sugar, which I had tried to add the first time, or I had tried to cut it with a little bit of millet flour to get it to be softer, but actually these were equally as soft. Like whether I cut it with another flour or not, it was the same. So this was the most basic recipe. It added some nice flavor to it because the miso brought out some of that flavor. So yeah, those are our whole wheat or whole spelt, whole food plant-based buns. So I hope you all enjoy. And yeah, if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon. I have a Patreon. Yeah, so I will see you all again next time. All right, bye.